Nigeria today is home to more than 200 million people, organized into over 250 distinct ethnic groups, speaking hundreds of different languages, in a country whose borders were drawn by colonial administrators with almost no regard for the deep and ancient population history that already existed there. For decades, the common assumption about Nigerian ancestry has been fairly simple, a story of largely separate ethnic groups, Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, Fulani, and hundreds of others, each with its own distinct and largely independent origin somewhere within West Africa. Recently, a series of genetic studies looking closely at populations across Nigeria produced a picture considerably more surprising than that simple story. One that connects Nigeria not just to the rest of West Africa, but to a genetic legacy stretching across nearly the entire African continent, and, in one particularly unexpected case, reaching all the way into Eurasia itself. Nigeria's borders were drawn in 1914 when British colonial authorities merged two separate administrative territories, the northern and southern protectorates, into a single unified colony for reasons that had almost everything to do with administrative convenience and almost nothing to do with the actual historical, cultural, or genetic relationships between the populations being merged together. This single administrative decision brought together populations whose actual histories, migrations, and deep ancestral connections stretch in completely different directions across the map. Some connected primarily to populations further south and west along the West African coast. Others connected to populations stretching north across the Sahel toward the Sahara. And still others, as this research eventually revealed, connected to population movements reaching across nearly the entire breadth of the African continent. Understanding the real genetic history hiding underneath this relatively young political boundary requires setting the modern map aside almost entirely, and instead following the evidence exactly where the DNA itself leads. Before we get into what the DNA actually revealed, you need to understand why Nigeria occupies such a genuinely unusual position on the map of world genetics, a position that has almost nothing to do with the country's modern political borders and everything to do with geography that has shaped human movement in this region for tens of thousands of years. Nigeria sits at the point where West Africa's coastal rainforest belt meets the drier savanna regions, stretching toward the Sahara, and further east, where this same territory borders the Cameroon highlands, a region researchers have identified as one of the single most important points of origin for population movements that would eventually reshape the genetic map of nearly half the African continent. This kind of ecological crossroads position, sitting at the meeting point between multiple distinct environmental zones, tends to produce exactly the kind of complex, layered population history that researchers found once they actually looked closely at the genetic data. Regions positioned at the boundary between rainforest, savanna, and semi-arid grassland tend to serve, throughout human history, as natural corridors and contact zones between populations, adapted to very different environments and very different subsistence strategies. Farming communities suited to the dense, humid rainforest belt, herding populations suited to open grassland, and populations along the Sahel, adapted to the increasingly dry conditions bordering the Sahara itself. Nigeria's geography places it directly across several of these ecological boundaries simultaneously, a positioning that, as this research would go on to demonstrate, left a measurable and lasting imprint on the genetic history of the populations living there. There are three questions this investigation set out to answer, and I want you to hold on to all three, because the way they resolve at the end of this video connects Nigeria to a story far larger than most people, including many Nigerians themselves, ever learned in school. First, where does the deep ancestral lineage of Nigeria's major ethnic groups actually trace back to, and how far back does that lineage extend? Second, what role did populations from this specific region of West Africa play in one of the largest and most consequential human migrations in African history? And third, and this is the part that genuinely surprised the researchers involved, why does one specific and historically significant Nigerian population carry a genetic signature that should not, by any conventional expectation, be there at all? Answering these questions required researchers to draw on multiple independent lines of evidence, combining whole genome sequencing from individuals across dozens of Nigerian ethnic groups with comparative data collected from populations across the rest of Africa and, where relevant, from outside the continent entirely. This kind of broad comparative approach matters enormously for a country as ethnically diverse as Nigeria, because any single population sample, taken in isolation, risks producing a misleadingly narrow picture, one that might accurately describe the ancestry of one specific ethnic group while saying almost nothing meaningful about Nigeria's population history as a whole. Only by comparing multiple ethnic groups against each other and against the wider African genetic landscape surrounding them could researchers begin to piece together a picture detailed enough to actually answer questions this large in scope. To understand where this investigation begins, you have to look at the deep genetic structure of West Africa as a whole, structure that researchers have been mapping in increasing detail over the past 2 decades, using DNA collected from populations across the entire region. West Africa carries some of the oldest and most diverse human genetic lineages found anywhere on Earth, a reflection of the fact that this region has been continuously inhabited by modern humans for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, likely tens of thousands of years longer than most other regions humans eventually settled outside of Africa. Populations across present-day Nigeria carry Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA lineages that rank among the deepest and most ancient branches found anywhere in the human family tree. Branches that split off from other human lineages so long ago that their exact age remains difficult to pin down with complete precision, but that clearly place West African populations, including those in Nigeria, among the most ancestrally deep-rooted human populations currently living anywhere on the planet. This deep-rootedness makes intuitive sense once you consider the basic outline of human evolutionary history. Modern humans originated in Africa, and the vast majority of human evolutionary history, by an enormous margin, took place entirely within the African continent before any population ever migrated outward into the rest of the world. Populations that never left Africa in the first place, remaining instead within the continent where humans had already been living, adapting, and diversifying for hundreds of thousands of years, naturally carry a correspondingly deeper and more branching genetic history than populations descended from the comparatively recent migrations that eventually populated Europe, Asia, the Americas, and Oceania. Migrations that, on the timescale of overall human evolutionary history, occurred remarkably recently within roughly the last 60 to 70,000 years. West African populations, including those across modern Nigeria, sit close to the very roots of this entire evolutionary tree, carrying genetic diversity and depth that populations outside Africa, by simple virtue of descending from a much smaller and more recent founding group, generally cannot match, a difference reflected directly in the sheer number of distinct genetic branches researchers can identify within West African populations. Compared to almost anywhere else studied, a pattern population geneticists sometimes summarize by pointing out that 2 individuals sampled from within a single Nigerian ethnic group can, in some cases, carry more genetic difference between them than 2 individuals sampled from opposite ends of Europe or East Asia. This deep ancestral foundation set the stage for the first major finding to come out of this broader research effort, a finding connecting Nigeria directly to one of the most significant population expansions in the entire history of the African continent. Linguists have long known that a huge portion of sub-Saharan Africa, stretching from Cameroon in the west all the way down to South Africa in the southeast, is dominated by a closely related family of languages known as the Bantu languages, spoken today by several 100 million people across dozens of modern countries. For over a century, researchers debated exactly where this enormous language family, and the populations who originally spoke it, actually originated before eventually spreading across such an enormous portion of the continent. Early theories about the Bantu expansion, developed largely during the colonial era, were often shaped as much by the racial and cultural assumptions of the European scholars, proposing them as by any solid evidence, with some early researchers reluctant to credit African populations themselves with organizing and carrying out a migration and cultural expansion of this scale and complexity. It took decades of careful linguistic reconstruction, comparing vocabulary, grammar, and sound patterns across hundreds of related Bantu languages to reconstruct their likely family tree, combined with archaeological evidence tracing the spread of specific technologies like iron smelting and particular styles of pottery across the continent, before a clearer picture finally began to emerge. Genetic evidence, arriving considerably later than either the linguistic or archaeological work, ultimately provided the most direct and compelling confirmation of where this expansion actually began, cutting through decades of academic debate with a level of precision neither language comparison nor pottery styles could offer entirely on their own, finally settling a question that had occupied multiple generations of researchers working across several very different academic disciplines. Genetic evidence, combined with detailed linguistic reconstruction, has increasingly pointed toward one specific answer: a relatively small region straddling the modern border between Nigeria and Cameroon, an area researchers now generally recognize as the original homeland of the entire Bantu language family and the population expansion that carried it across the continent. Starting somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago, populations from this specific Nigeria-Cameroon borderland region began a series of migrations that would eventually spread outward across an enormous portion of sub-Saharan Africa, moving south and east over the course of many centuries, gradually populating vast stretches of central, eastern, and southern Africa that had previously been home to entirely different populations, including groups ancestral to modern-day hunter-gatherer communities like certain Central African forest populations and Southern African click-speaking groups. This means that populations across a huge swath of the African continent today from parts of Cameroon and Gabon, through the Congo Basin, across East Africa, and all the way down into South Africa and beyond, carry genetic ancestry tracing back to this relatively small founding population that originated in what is now southeastern Nigeria and neighboring Cameroon. In other words, one of the largest and most consequential population expansions in the entire history of the African continent began in exactly the region that is home today to modern Nigeria's Igbo, Ibibio, and related ethnic groups, whose ancestors, or close genetic relatives of their ancestors, went on to become the genetic and linguistic founders of Bantu-speaking populations spread across roughly a third of the entire African continent. This connection also helps explain a linguistic pattern that had long puzzled researchers studying the internal structure of the Bantu language family itself. Bantu languages, spoken across most of Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa, despite being spread across an enormous geographic range, show relatively modest internal diversity when compared against each other, the kind of pattern you would expect from a language family that spread rapidly across a huge territory within a relatively limited span of time. Languages closely related to Bantu, but positioned just outside the core Bantu family itself, on the other hand, show dramatically higher levels of diversity, concentrated specifically within the Nigeria-Cameroon borderland region, exactly the pattern linguists expect to find surrounding the true point of origin of any language family, since languages generally accumulate the most internal diversity in the specific region where they have existed the longest, closest to their original source, while languages carried outward by more rapid, recent expansion tend to remain comparatively more uniform across the vast new territory they eventually came to occupy. Think about the scale of what that actually means. A population expansion originating in a relatively compact region of what is now southeastern Nigeria eventually produced descendant populations numbering in the hundreds of millions, spread across dozens of modern countries, speaking languages that, despite enormous geographic separation and thousands of years of independent development, still share a clear and traceable common linguistic ancestor. Nigeria, in this very specific and very real sense, functioned as one of the most significant population source points in the entire genetic and linguistic history of sub-Saharan Africa, a role that rarely gets the recognition it deserves outside of specialist academic circles studying African population history. For comparison, consider how differently this kind of migration story tends to be told and remembered when it involves other parts of the world. The Indo-European language family, spreading outward from a homeland, most researchers place somewhere in the Eurasian steppe several thousand years ago, is discussed extensively in popular history, documentaries, and school curricula across much of the world, treated as a foundational chapter in the story of how much of Europe and Asia came to be populated and linguistically shaped. The Bantu expansion, comparable in scale and historical significance, carried out entirely by African populations moving across African territory, rarely receives anything close to the same level of popular attention, despite reshaping the linguistic and genetic map of a third of an entire continent, and despite the wealth of genetic and linguistic evidence now available to tell its story in comparable and arguably even greater detail than most popular accounts of comparable migrations elsewhere in the world currently receive. If this had been the only major finding to come out of this research, it would already have represented a substantial rewriting of how Nigeria's role in African population history gets understood and taught. But researchers did not stop there, because when they turned their attention to specific ethnic groups within Nigeria itself, examining their genetic profiles in more granular detail, one population produced a result that genuinely did not fit the expected pattern at all, a finding significant enough to reshape how researchers think about population contact across the entire Sahara region. Up to this point, the working assumption among most researchers studying West African population genetics had been fairly straightforward: that the Sahara Desert, in its current form, had functioned as an almost complete genetic barrier separating sub-Saharan African populations from North African and Eurasian populations for at least the past several thousand years, with any measurable genetic contact between the two regions limited to relatively recent and well-documented historical events, such as the trans-Saharan trade routes and associated population movements that developed during the medieval period. The finding that emerged from Fulani genetic data suggested something considerably older and considerably more significant than anything the trans-Saharan trade routes alone could plausibly explain. The Fulani people, one of the largest and most widely distributed ethnic groups in West Africa, with significant populations spread across Nigeria, Niger, Mali, Senegal, and numerous other countries, stretching across the Sahel region, have long been culturally and historically distinct from many of their neighboring settled agricultural populations, traditionally maintaining a pastoralist lifestyle centered around cattle herding across the semi-arid grasslands bordering the Sahara. When researchers analyzed the genetic profile of Fulani populations in Nigeria and compared it against neighboring ethnic groups such as the Hausa, with whom the Fulani have shared close cultural, political, and geographic ties for centuries, they discovered something that immediately stood out from every other population examined in the broader study. Fulani genetic profiles consistently showed a measurable component of ancestry connected to populations from outside sub-Saharan Africa entirely, specifically carrying genetic signatures associated with populations from North Africa, and more surprisingly still, from parts of the Middle East and even further into Western Eurasia. This was not a small or ambiguous signal buried deep in statistical noise. It appeared consistently across Fulani samples collected from different countries and different regions, at a frequency significantly higher than found in any neighboring West African population examined in the same research, including populations the Fulani have lived alongside and often intermarried with for many centuries. If this Eurasian-related ancestry in Fulani populations had simply resulted from more recent intermarriage with neighboring Hausa communities, or other nearby groups with their own separate historical connections to North Africa, through more recent trade and religious contact following the spread of Islam across the region, researchers would have expected to see a comparable signal, even if slightly weaker, showing up in those neighboring populations as well. Instead, the signal appeared specifically and disproportionately concentrated within Fulani populations themselves, distinct enough from surrounding groups that researchers became confident they were looking at something considerably older and more specific to Fulani population history in particular, rather than a general regional signal shared broadly across everyone living in the same part of West Africa. This finding immediately raised an obvious question, one that took researchers considerably more work to answer than simply identifying the unusual genetic signal in the first place. If Fulani populations really do carry meaningful ancestry connecting them to North Africa and beyond, when and how did that connection actually occur, given that the Sahara Desert has functioned for most of the past several thousand years as one of the most significant natural barriers to human population movement found anywhere on Earth? The answer researchers eventually settled on connects directly to a period of African climate history that most people have never heard of, but that fundamentally reshaped the relationship between North and West Africa for thousands of years, a period climatologists refer to as the African humid period, sometimes called the time of the Green Sahara. Beginning roughly 10,000 years ago and lasting for several thousand years afterward, the region we now know as the Sahara Desert looked almost nothing like the vast, largely uninhabitable expanse of sand it represents today. Instead, this entire region was covered by extensive grasslands, seasonal lakes, rivers, and in some areas, genuine woodland, supporting large populations of humans and animals across territory that today receives almost no rainfall at all. During this extended period, the Sahara functioned not as a barrier separating North Africa from sub-Saharan Africa, but as a genuinely habitable corridor, one that allowed sustained contact and very likely significant population movement between populations living on opposite sides of what would eventually become one of the most formidable deserts on the planet. As the African humid period gradually ended, beginning roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, and the Sahara slowly transformed into the arid desert we recognize today, populations who had been living across this once green corridor faced a dramatic choice, forced by rapidly deteriorating environmental conditions, to either retreat toward the increasingly rare remaining water sources, migrate outward toward the edges of the desertifying region, or adapt their entire way of life to survive in an increasingly hostile and unpredictable environment. Researchers now believe that Fulani ancestors were likely among the populations caught up in exactly this transition. Pastoralist groups whose cattle-herding lifestyle itself likely adopted from populations connected to this same trans-Saharan contact zone allowed them to adapt to the increasingly marginal grasslands along the desert's expanding southern edge far more successfully than populations relying primarily on settled agriculture. This history helps explain not just the unusual genetic signature found in modern Fulani populations, but also several distinctive cultural and physical characteristics that have long set the Fulani apart from many of their neighboring West African populations, features that outside observers noted for centuries, without ever having a clear scientific explanation for their underlying cause. The pastoralist cattle-herding lifestyle itself, historically unusual within the specific ecological context of West Africa's coastal and savanna regions, along with certain distinctive cultural and physical traits observed within Fulani communities, both fit remarkably well with a population history involving substantial ancestral contact with populations from further north, contact that appears to have occurred during, or shortly after, the final centuries of the Green Sahara period, before the desert's transformation eventually cut off the kind of easy, sustained population movement that had connected these regions for thousands of years beforehand. Archaeological evidence recovered from sites across the central and southern Sahara lends additional support to this picture, revealing rock art depicting cattle herding scenes across huge stretches of territory that today receive virtually no rainfall at all, artwork whose creators clearly lived alongside large domesticated herds in landscapes that must have looked dramatically greener and more habitable than anything found in the same locations now. Some of this rock art depicts herding practices and cultural motifs that bear striking resemblance to traditions still practiced by Fulani pastoralist communities today. A continuity that, while difficult to prove with absolute certainty on its own, fits remarkably well alongside the genetic evidence pointing toward a Fulani population history deeply connected to exactly this now vanished green Saharan landscape. It is important to be precise about exactly what this finding does and does not mean. It does not suggest that the Fulani people are somehow less authentically West African than their neighbors, or that their identity and history should be understood as fundamentally separate from the broader West African populations they have lived alongside for thousands of years. The overwhelming majority of Fulani ancestry remains solidly rooted in the same deep sub-Saharan African genetic foundation shared across the region. What this finding adds is a specific, well-documented layer of additional ancestry connected to a real and scientifically well-understood period of African climate history, explaining a genuine population contact event that occurred thousands of years ago, rather than representing any kind of separate or lesser claim to West African identity in the present day. Fulani communities today are, in every meaningful cultural and historical sense, thoroughly West African, deeply embedded within the political, religious, and economic life of the countries across the Sahel and beyond where they have lived for millennia, sharing extensive cultural exchange, intermarriage, and shared history with neighboring populations across that entire span of time. This particular finding adds historical depth and scientific explanation to a distinctive population history, rather than in any way separating the Fulani from the broader West African world of which they have always been, and remain today, a genuinely integral part. Taken together, these two major findings, the Nigeria-Cameroon borderland's role as the ancestral homeland of the entire Bantu language family, and the Fulani people's unexpected trans-Saharan genetic connection, paint a picture of Nigeria's genetic history considerably richer and considerably more consequential to the wider history of the African continent than most popular accounts have ever given it credit for. This is not a country whose population history unfolded in isolation, quietly separate from the rest of the continent's story. It is a region that, at different points across thousands of years of history, functioned as both a major source of population expansion, reshaping half the continent, and as a destination for population contact, reaching all the way across the Sahara, toward North Africa and beyond. So when someone asks where Nigerian ancestry actually comes from, the honest answer, based on everything this research has uncovered, is considerably more layered and considerably more historically significant than most people, inside or outside Nigeria, ever learned growing up. Nigeria's deep ancestral roots reach back among the oldest and most ancestrally diverse human lineages found anywhere on the continent. A relatively small region of what is now southeastern Nigeria gave rise to one of the largest population and language expansions in African history, whose descendants today number in the hundreds of millions and span roughly a third of the entire continent. And at least one major Nigerian population, the Fulani, carries a genuine and well-documented genetic connection reaching across the Sahara itself, a legacy of a period of African climate history most people have never even heard of, let alone connected to the ancestry of a modern West African population. That is the story this genetic research actually tells, and it is a far richer and far more globally significant story than the simplified picture most people carry around regarding Nigerian, and more broadly, West African, population history. It is a story about how a single region can simultaneously serve as an ancient point of origin for one of the largest population expansions on an entire continent, while also absorbing, through an entirely separate historical process thousands of years later, genetic contact reaching across one of the most formidable natural barriers on the planet. Nigeria's population history is not a simple, isolated story. It is deeply woven into the wider genetic history of Africa as a whole, in ways that most standard historical accounts have never fully captured. It is a history that flows in more than one direction at once, outward from Nigeria toward the rest of the continent through the Bantu expansion, and inward toward Nigeria from across the Sahara through the ancestors of the Fulani, two separate currents of ancient population movement that happen to converge within the borders of a single modern country, borders that, as it turns out, capture almost none of the deeper story running quietly underneath them. There is something worth sitting with here that extends beyond the specific genetic findings themselves, something about how national borders, drawn relatively recently and often with little regard for underlying population history, can obscure just how deeply connected different regions and peoples actually are once you look past the modern map. Nigeria, as a political entity, is barely more than a century old, but the population movements and genetic connections this research traces back extend across thousands, and in some cases tens of thousands of years, weaving Nigerian populations into genetic and historical relationships spanning nearly the entire African continent, and, through the Fulani, reaching even beyond it. Modern borders are useful for organizing present-day political life, but they capture almost nothing of the deep, sprawling, and genuinely ancient population history that continues to live on, quietly encoded in the DNA of the people living within them today. If this video showed you anything, it is that even a country as large, as populous, and as thoroughly studied as Nigeria can still hold genuinely surprising secrets about its own deep population history, connections reaching across an entire continent, and, in at least one remarkable case, across one of the most formidable deserts on Earth. There are other major populations out there whose deep genetic history remains just as poorly understood by the general public as Nigeria's was before this research, still waiting for the same kind of careful genetic investigation to reveal exactly how far their own ancestral connections actually reach. Connections that, more often than not, turn out to stretch across far more of the map than anyone currently expects. If you want to know which population's hidden history gets uncovered next, make sure you are subscribed, because the next investigation in this series is already underway. And based on everything we have seen so far, it is unlikely to be the simple story anyone currently assumes it to be. And if Nigeria's own hidden history is anything to go by, the real answer will almost certainly turn out to be more interconnected and more remarkable than the version most people have grown up believing.